The wind howled across the Afghan mountains at 0300 hours, carrying with it the smell of dust and distant gunpowder. Through the scope of her Barrett M82, one Sergeant Major Nix Calloway watched the world in shades of green through her night vision optics. 2,400 meters below her position, 7 men moved like shadows through the rocky terrain toward their objective. Ghost Unit 7, her brothers. Silent Angel, this is Ghost Lead, the voice crackled in her earpiece. Sergeant Flynn O'Malley, her spotter, her best friend. Eyes clear on our approach, Vector. Nix adjusted her scope, scanning the compound walls, the surrounding ridgelines, the natural choke points where an ambush would be most effective. The crosshairs drifted across empty positions, abandoned guard posts, eerily silent streets. Every instinct she had developed over 6 years of combat operations was screaming that something was wrong. Ghost Lead, I'm seeing anomalies in enemy positioning, she whispered into her mic. Patterns all wrong. They're not where intel said they'd be. Copy that, Angel. What's your assessment? Nix's finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Never on the trigger until you were ready to take a life. That's what Sergeant Major Declan Sullivan had taught her when she was 18 years old and thought she knew everything about being a soldier. Old Bull Sullivan, they called him. Gulf War veteran. 217 confirmed kills over a 30-year career. The man who had seen something in a skinny girl from Montana and turned her into one of the deadliest snipers in the United States military. Stand by, Ghost Lead. She swept her scope across the compound again. Something's not. Then she saw it. 3 men on a rooftop that should have been empty. 4 more in windows that intel had marked as abandoned. A heavy machine gun emplacement that hadn't been there in yesterday's satellite imagery, all positioned in with perfect overlapping fields of fire on the exact route Ghost Unit was taking. They knew. Someone had told them everything. Ghost Lead, abort. Nix's voice cut through the radio with desperate urgency. It's a trap. They're waiting for you. The compound is... The first explosions turned night into day. Through her scope, Nix watched the IED detonate directly beneath Sergeant Benjamin Whitaker's position. 24 years old, engaged to his high school sweetheart. The ring was still in his pocket, tucked in a waterproof case next to his heart. She didn't have time to process that thought because the machine guns opened up a heartbeat later. Training took over. Emotion disappeared. There was only the scope, the wind calculation, the slight adjustment for temperature and humidity at this altitude. Nix's breathing slowed to the point where each heartbeat became a separate measurable event. First target, machine gunner on the north rooftop. Range 2,420 meters. Crosswind 7 knots from the east. Adjust 2 minutes of angle right, 1 minute high for the elevation difference. Breathe out. Hold. The Barrett roared. Through the scope, she watched the machine gunner's head snap back, the weapon going silent. But there were too many of them. Ghost Unit was pinned down in a kill zone that had been prepared specifically for them, and there was only 1 rifle on the ridgeline above. Angel, we need fire support. That was Sergeant Lucas Brennan, 32 years old, father of 3 children under the age of 8. His youngest daughter had been born while he was deployed to Iraq. He'd seen her face for the first time on a grainy video call, and he'd cried like a baby. Nix acquired her second target. Breathe, hold, fire. The RPG gunner in the eastern window collapsed before he could launch the rocket that would have ended all 7 of them. QRF is 30 minutes out, she transmitted, working the bolt on the Barrett with mechanical precision. Hold position, I'm providing cover. Third target, fourth, fifth, each shot was perfect. Each shot was too late. Through the scope, she watched Sergeant Tyler Garrison take a round through the chest. 29 years old, 6 months from retirement. He'd already accepted a job teaching history at a high school in Colorado. He'd told her that kids needed to understand what service really meant, what sacrifice looked like when it wasn't in a movie or a video game. The scope found another target, 6th kill. But the enemy knew where she was now. Rounds started impacting the rocks around her position. She ignored them. There was only the scope, only the targets, only the desperate attempt to save the men dying below. Angel, we're cut off. Sergeant Connor Rafferty's voice strained with pain. 27 years old. Sent half his pay home every month to support his mother, who was fighting cancer. Kirkland's hit bad. We need... The transmission cut off. Sergeant Mason Kirkland, 31 years old. Combat medic. 3 Purple Hearts, 47 lives saved in previous deployments. He'd once told Nix that every soldier he saved was a brother who got to go home to their family, and that was worth more than any medal the Army could give him. 7th target, 8th, 9th. Nix's hands moved like machines loading firing, working the bolt, finding the next threat. Her shoulder would be black and blue for weeks from the recoil. She didn't feel it. She felt nothing except the desperate need to keep shooting, to keep protecting, to somehow turn back time and warn them before they ever entered that compound. Ghost Unit, this is Angel. Her voice was steady despite the chaos below. I have eyes on QRF approaching from the south. 2 minutes out. Stay alive for 2 more minutes. 10th kill. 11th. 12th. Angel. Flynn's voice was weak now, barely a whisper. Angel, I can't. There's too much blood. Flynn, stay with me. For the first time, emotion cracked through Nix's professional calm. QRF is almost there. 30 seconds. 13th kill. 14th. The Barrett's barrel was hot enough to raise heat mirages through the scope. Tell my mom. Flynn coughed and Nix could hear the blood in his lungs through the radio. Tell her I wasn't scared. Tell her I did my duty. You tell her yourself, you Irish bastard. Nix was crying now, tears running down her face as she acquired her 15th target. You're going to walk out of there and tell her yourself. 15th kill, 16th, 17th. The radio went silent. Through the scope, Nix watched the QRF breach the compound. She watched them find 7 bodies arranged in a defensive perimeter, each man having died trying to protect the others. She watched the medics shake their heads one after another, confirming what she already knew from her position 2,400 meters above. Ghost Unit 7 was gone. All of them. Sergeant Benjamin Whitaker, Sergeant Lucas Brennan, Sergeant Tyler Garrison, Sergeant Connor Rafferty, Sergeant Mason Kirkland, Sergeant Isaac Drummond, Sergeant Flynn O'Malley, her brothers. QRF, this is Silent Angel. Her voice was flat now, empty of everything except the mechanical reporting of facts. I'm the sole survivor of Ghost Unit 7. 17 confirmed enemy kills from Overwatch position. All friendly personnel are KIA. Request immediate extraction. As she began breaking down her rifle, preparing for the long climb down to the compound, one thought kept echoing through her mind, louder than the gunfire, louder than the dying screams she'd heard over the radio. They knew. The enemy had known everything. The route, the timing, the approach vector, the personnel count. Someone had told them. Someone with access to the highest levels of classified operational planning had sold out Ghost Unit 7, and Nix was going to find them. Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. 8 months later, the Silver T-Service rattled slightly on the cart as Nix pushed it through the corridors of Ring E. The sound was deliberate. People expected service staff to make a little noise, to be slightly clumsy, to be forgettable. Invisible. That was exactly what she needed them to think. Her uniform was plain gray, 2 sizes too large, designed to hide her athletic build. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, no makeup, no jewelry, except for a cheap watch with a cracked crystal. She kept her eyes downcast, her posture slightly stooped, her movements practiced to suggest someone who had spent years carrying heavy trays and accepting disrespect with quiet resignation. Every morning for the past 6 months, Nix had looked at herself in the mirror and seen a stranger. The transformation was complete. Sergeant Major Nix Calloway, one of the deadliest snipers in the United States military, had disappeared. In her place was a forgettable woman who served tea at the Pentagon and whom no one would ever suspect of being capable of anything more dangerous than organizing a filing cabinet. The cart's wheels squeaked slightly as she approached Conference Room E7. Through the small window in the door, she could see them gathering. 12 of the highest-ranking military officers in the American Armed Forces settling into leather chairs around a mahogany table that had seen decades of decisions that shaped the world. Somewhere in that room, or in the rooms adjacent to it, was the person who had murdered her brothers. Nix took a breath, let it out slowly, and pushed open the door. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said softly, her voice pitched higher than her natural register with a slight tremor that suggested nervousness. "I have your tea service." Most of them didn't even look up. That was fine. She'd spent 6 months learning to read people who thought they were invisible to her. The nervous finger-tapping of Colonel Preston Ashford, the way Captain Wade Thornton checked his reflection in every shiny surface, adjusting his uniform to show off his combat ribbons. The cold calculation in General Everett Hawthorne's eyes as he reviewed classified documents. But one man noticed her. Sergeant Major Declan Sullivan sat in the corner taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and his eyes followed her movements with the attention of someone who had spent 30 years identifying threats on battlefields. Old Bull Sullivan, her mentor. The man who'd taught her everything about being a sniper, about reading wind and terrain, and the 1,000 tiny details that separated a good shot from a perfect one. He was part of this investigation, feeding information back to the Inspector General's office, but they'd agreed that he would maintain his cover as note-taker and observer while she worked undercover as service staff. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His left eyebrow twitched upward by perhaps a millimeter. An acknowledgement, a reminder to stay focused. Nix lowered her gaze and began setting out teacups with practiced precision. "Get her out of this room immediately." The voice boomed across the conference space with the kind of authority that came from 30 years of commanding men in combat. Admiral Garrison Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his steel trident pin glinting under the fluorescent lights, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Nix with the kind of dismissive contempt usually reserved for enemy combatants. "We're discussing classified alpha-level intelligence about Operation Desert Shield 2. Blackwood continued, his voice carrying that peculiar quality of men who had never been contradicted. "Does she even have the proper clearance to be in here?" Nix continued setting out cups, her hands steady despite the sudden scrutiny. Through her peripheral vision, she cataloged every reaction in the room. Ashford's nervous swallow, Thornton's smirk, Hawthorne's impatient sigh, Dr. Sienna Marlowe, the civilian analyst, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. "Admiral, she's just delivering the tea service," Dr. Marlowe said quietly. "Perhaps we could—" "Doctor Marlowe, with all due respect, you're not military." Blackwood's tone made it clear exactly how much respect he thought civilian analysts deserved. "Some of us understand the importance of operational security." Colonel Ashford leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "How did civilian staff get access during a security briefing? This is completely unacceptable." "I apologize for the intrusion, sir." Nix kept her voice soft, apologetic, barely above a whisper. "I'll be finished in just a moment." Captain Thornton nudged the officer beside him, a Marine major named Brooks, who had actual combat experience and knew better than to underestimate anyone. "I bet she's never even held a real weapon, let alone understood military tactics." Thornton's voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that came from men who'd never really been tested. "Probably thinks a suppressor is something you use on a car." The room filled with condescending laughter. Nix placed the final teacup on the table, her movements precise and mechanical. But something in her posture had changed, something so subtle that only someone with Sullivan's experience would have noticed. Her shoulders had squared by perhaps a quarter inch. Her feet had shifted to shoulder-width apart. Her weight had distributed itself in perfect balance. It was the posture of someone who could move in any direction instantly with lethal efficiency. Sullivan noticed. His pen stopped moving on his legal pad. Miss Blackwood's voice had taken on that patient, condescending tone that men used when explaining obvious things to people they considered intellectually inferior. "I need you to understand something. We're planning operations that could determine the fate of American servicemen and women overseas. This isn't a place for civilians who don't understand the gravity of what we do." Nix nodded respectfully, but as she moved around the table to collect the empty cream pitcher, her eyes briefly scanned the tactical map spread across the mahogany surface. Satellite imagery of mountainous terrain, grid coordinates, elevation markers, troop movement vectors. Afghanistan, Kandahar province, the same region where her brothers had died. For just a moment, her jaw tightened. Just a fraction of a second where the mask slipped and something cold and dangerous showed through. Sullivan caught it. His pen moved to his pad. "Maintain cover." "Sir." Dr. Marlowe tried again, her voice carrying genuine compassion. "She's just doing her job. Perhaps we could continue once she's finished." "The problem, Dr. Marlowe, is that you don't seem to grasp the sensitivity of what we're discussing." Major Brooks, the Army Ranger, leaned forward. His multiple deployment ribbons testified to actual combat experience, unlike Thornton's carefully curated collection of participation medals. "We can't have unauthorized personnel present when we're discussing troop movements in tactical positions." Nix finished arranging the tea service and stepped back, her hands clasped behind her back in what appeared to be a respectful gesture. But Sullivan could see what the others missed. Her hands weren't clasped in deference. They were positioned for immediate access to anything that might be used as a weapon. The letter opener on the side table, the heavy glass paperweight, even the silver tea service itself. She was threat assessing, calculating, planning. "What's your security clearance level, miss?" Blackwood demanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I serve where I'm needed, sir." Nix's response was carefully measured and neutral. Ashford laughed harshly. "That's not an answer. Either you have clearance or you don't. This isn't some civilian office where anyone can wander in during meetings." The tension in the room was building like a summer thunderstorm on the Montana plains where Nix had grown up. The officers were waiting for Blackwood to dismiss her to restore the proper order of things, where enlisted personnel and civilian staff knew their place and stayed there. But something about Nix's calm demeanor seemed to irritate Blackwood further. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't apologizing profusely. She was simply standing there with quiet dignity, waiting for orders, and somehow that made everything worse. "You know what I think," Thornton said with a smirk that made Nix's fingers twitch behind her back. "I think our little tea server here watches too many military movies. Probably thinks she knows something about what we do." More laughter rippled through the room, but it was cut short when Blackwood's aide knocked on the door. "Sir, we have updated satellite intelligence from CENTCOM," the aide announced, entering with a classified folder marked with red diagonal stripes. As Blackwood reviewed the documents, his expression grew grave. The room fell silent, waiting. "Gentlemen, we have a problem." Blackwood looked up from the folder, and for the first time, there was genuine emotion in his voice. Anger, frustration, perhaps even a hint of fear. "Our intelligence suggests there was a leak in the Afghanistan operations. Sensitive coordinates were compromised 14 months ago, resulting in the loss of an entire special operations unit." Nix's hands, still clasped behind her back, tightened until her knuckles went white. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, but something fundamental had shifted in her posture. Every muscle in her body had gone rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with barely contained rage. Sullivan saw it. He made another note on his pad. "Ghost Unit 7, Blackwood continued reading from the classified report. 7 highly trained operators, all killed in action during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. The leaked coordinates led to an ambush." Through the window behind Blackwood, morning sunlight cast long shadows across the conference table. Dust motes drifted in the air like tiny galaxies. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors providing a rhythmic backdrop to Blackwood's words. "We need to identify how this information was compromised," Blackwood said, his voice tight with frustration. "Too many good soldiers have died because of security breaches like this." As he spoke, Nix moved to collect the empty cream pitcher, but her movement brought her closer to the tactical displays spread across the table. She was close enough now to read the coordinates, to see the operational details, to memorize everything in the photographic way that had made her such an effective sniper. Blackwood noticed her proximity to the classified materials and exploded. "What are you still doing here?" His voice cracked like a whip across the room. "I thought I made it clear that you need to leave." "She's finishing the service, Admiral," Dr. Marlowe said defensively. "There's no need to be harsh." "Harsh," Blackwood's voice rose. "Dr. Marlowe, you clearly don't understand military protocol. We don't discuss classified operations in front of unauthorized personnel, no matter how harmless they might appear." Ashford stood as well, his patience clearly exhausted, though there was something else in his movement. A nervousness, a tension that went beyond simple irritation at a service worker's presence. "Security should escort her out immediately. We can't continue with civilians present during discussions of this sensitivity." But as they continued their discussion, none of them noticed that Nix had positioned herself with a clear view of the entire room. Her seemingly humble task of clearing the tea service provided perfect cover for observing every face, every reaction, every tell that might indicate guilt or knowledge. She watched Ashford's left hand tremor slightly as he reached for his water glass. Noted Thornton's pupils dilating when Blackwood mentioned the Ghost Unit betrayal. Saw Hawthorne's jaw muscles clench and release in a pattern that suggested he was grinding his teeth. One of them knew something, or all of them did. That was the problem with systematic security failures. Sometimes it wasn't one traitor. Sometimes it was an entire culture of negligence that got good soldiers killed. Blackwood deliberately knocked his coffee cup over, sending the dark liquid spreading across some non-classified papers on the edge of the table. "Clean this up," he ordered, curtly, watching Nix with the calculating attention of someone testing a theory. Nix immediately moved to address the spill, but her cleaning technique would have seemed strange to anyone who actually understood military protocols. She didn't just wipe up the coffee randomly. She worked in a precise grid pattern containing the liquid at its edges before expanding outward using the most efficient method possible to prevent any secondary damage or spread. It was the exact technique taught in military training for dealing with chemical spills or contaminated areas in combat zones. Major Brooks, who had spent 18 months in Iraq dealing with everything from biological weapons to crude oil fires, found himself watching her technique with growing curiosity. His eyes narrowed. That wasn't civilian janitorial training. That was someone who understood containment protocols at a level that took months of military instruction to master. "Interesting approach to spill containment," he murmured to himself quietly enough that only Sullivan caught it. As the discussion resumed, Admiral Blackwood began outlining tactical positions for future operations in the Kandahar region. The problem with this terrain, he said, pointing to the map with a laser pointer that cast a small red dot across the mountains, is the elevation changes make accurate fire support calculations extremely difficult. Sir Major Brooks interjected, pulling out his field calculator. According to our standard ballistics reports, the effective range for that terrain would be approximately 2,000 meters. Beyond that, we'd need specialized sniper support, and even then, 2,400. The voice was barely audible, more breath than sound, but in the sudden silence of the conference room, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned toward Nyx. She was still crouched beside the table, paper towels in hand, looking at the coffee stain as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. But her lips had moved. Those two words had definitely come from her. The room fell absolutely silent. Blackwood turned slowly, deliberately, like a tank turret acquiring a target. "Excuse me," Nyx looked up from the table, her cheeks flushing slightly with what appeared to be embarrassment. "I apologize, sir, I shouldn't have spoken." "No, no." Blackwood's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone of a predator that had just spotted something interesting. "Please enlighten us. What did you say?" I, I just thought the range calculation might be different at that elevation," Nyx said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, I'll just finish cleaning and the effective range would be 2,400 meters." Blackwood interrupted. "That's what you said." "How would you possibly know that?" Thornton laughed loudly, slapping his palm on the table. "Oh, this is rich. Our tea lady thinks she's a ballistics expert now. What's next tactical advice from the janitor?" But Major Brooks wasn't laughing. He was hunched over his field calculator, fingers moving rapidly across the keys, entering numbers for altitude, atmospheric pressure, temperature, variance, wind conditions. The calculator beeped softly. Brooks stared at the result, then looked up at Nyx with an expression somewhere between shock and respect. "Actually, sir," Brooks said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Accounting for the altitude at Kandahar, which is approximately 6,800 feet, and the atmospheric pressure differential at that elevation, along with typical temperature variance and prevailing wind conditions, she's right. The effective range would be closer to 2,400 meters." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room like fog rolling into a valley. How did a civilian service worker know advanced ballistics calculations that required specialized training and field experience to understand? How did someone who served tea know the exact modifications needed for high-altitude sniper operations? Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Nyx more carefully, really looking at her for the first time since she'd entered the room. There was something about her posture now, something he couldn't quite identify, but that triggered instincts developed over 30 years of combat operations. "That's quite an educated guess for someone who serves tea," he said slowly. I, I watch a lot of documentaries, sir." Nyx's voice was weak, apologetic, clearly trying to downplay her knowledge. "Military history. I find it interesting." "What kind of documentaries?" General Hawthorne leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Just general military history, sir. Nothing specific." Ashford scoffed, but there was something forced about his dismissal, something that didn't quite ring true. "Watching documentaries doesn't make you qualified to discuss tactical operations, young lady. Major Brooks, are you certain about that calculation?" Brooks nodded, still staring at his calculator display as if it had just revealed the secrets of the universe. "I'm certain, Colonel. At that altitude with standard atmospheric conditions, the effective range for a properly trained marksman with appropriate equipment would be 2,400 meters, potentially further with optimal conditions." The meeting continued, but there was now an undercurrent of curiosity about the quiet woman who had demonstrated unexpected knowledge. Blackwood found himself testing her, dropping military terminology into his conversations to see if she would react. When he mentioned clicks as a measurement, Nyx didn't flinch at the military slang for kilometers. When Ashford discussed MOUT classifications, military operations in urban terrain, her expression remained carefully neutral, but she didn't ask for clarification the way a true civilian would have. Sullivan watched all of this from his corner, his pen moving steadily across his legal pad, but he wasn't taking notes about the meeting anymore. He was documenting every test, every reaction, every moment where Nyx's cover held or threatened to slip. Dr. Marlowe noticed the dynamic changing in the room. "Perhaps we should focus on the task at hand rather than interrogating the staff," she suggested diplomatically, though there was steel under her polite tone. But Blackwood's testing became more pointed. The problem with urban warfare, he said loudly, as if lecturing a classroom, is dealing with what we call blue-on-blue situations. Several officers nodded knowingly. Blue-on-blue, friendly fire. The nightmare scenario where your own forces ended up shooting each other through confusion or miscommunication. Nix's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely noticeable tension in her jaw. But it was there, that instant of recognition, that flash of understanding, that she knew exactly what blue on blue meant, and probably had more experience with combat terminology than anyone in the room wanted to consider. Sullivan saw it. He made another note. "Sergeant Major Sullivan," Blackwood called out suddenly, "verify something for me. Check our security database and tell me exactly what clearance level Miss Calloway, sir," Nix supplied quietly. "Nix Calloway. Miss Calloway possesses." Sullivan stood moving to the computer terminal at the side of the room with the deliberate slowness of an older man who had earned the right to take his time. He logged in, navigated through several security screens, and then stopped staring at his monitor. For a moment, he didn't move, just stared at the screen as if it were showing him something impossible. "Sergeant Major," Blackwood prompted. "What does it say?" Sullivan looked up, and for just a moment his eyes met Nix's across the room. There was something in that look. Respect, pride, and perhaps a warning. "Sir," Sullivan said slowly, clearly, "according to our records, Miss Calloway has level 5 clearance, verified as of 0600 hours this morning, signed off by the Inspector General's office." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Level 5 clearance was higher than most of the officers present possessed. It was the kind of clearance reserved for people working on the most sensitive operations dealing with intelligence that could reshape international relations or expose sources deep in enemy territory. "That's impossible," Ashford protested, his voice rising with genuine alarm. "She's civilian support staff. There must be some mistake in the system." "The computer doesn't lie, sir," Sullivan replied, turning his monitor so the room could see the official verification screen. "Clearance verified. Current as of this morning. Authorization codes are valid and cross-referenced with the IG's office." Blackwood stared at the screen, then at Nix, who continued organizing the tea service as if nothing unusual had happened. "How does a service worker get level 5 clearance?" "Maybe there's been a clerical error," Hawthorne suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Sullivan shook his head. "No error, sir. The authorization codes are current, valid, and properly encrypted. Someone with very high authority specifically granted Miss Calloway access to this level of classified material." The implications hung in the air like smoke after a firefight. If Nix had level 5 clearance, she wasn't just a random civilian worker who'd wandered into a classified briefing. She was here deliberately, with authorization, for a reason. Blackwood's frustration was mounting into something approaching anger. Nothing about this woman made sense. Her knowledge of military tactics, her bearing, her security clearance, her complete lack of reaction to being questioned by some of the highest-ranking officers in the American military, it all contradicted her apparent role as humble service staff. "Miss Calloway," Blackwood said formally, his voice tight with controlled tension, "I think we need some clarification about exactly who you are and why you're here." Before Nix could respond, the conference room door opened, and a man in an expensive gray suit entered. Director Sterling Graves, CIA. His presence in a military operational briefing was unusual enough. His deliberate nod of acknowledgement toward Nix was even more unusual. Director Graves, Blackwood stood immediately, military courtesy overriding his frustration. "We weren't expecting CIA involvement in this operation." "Admiral Blackwood," Graves replied smoothly, his voice carrying that particular quality of intelligence officers who knew more than they were saying. "I'm here to observe the briefing. Please continue." But Blackwood noticed that Graves had positioned himself where he could see both the assembled officers and Nix. More puzzling was the fact that Nix didn't seem surprised by Graves's presence. If anything, there was a subtle relaxation in her posture, as if his arrival was expected, planned, anticipated. The discussion resumed, focusing on the security breach that had led to Ghost Unit's casualties. Blackwood laid out the timeline of events with military precision, showing how classified coordinates had been leaked just hours before the mission. "Someone with access to the highest levels of operational planning betrayed those men," Blackwood said gravely, and there was genuine anger in his voice now. "Not at Nix, but at whoever had committed this ultimate betrayal. We need to identify the source of this leak before it happens again, before more American soldiers die because someone sold them out for money or ideology or whatever justification traitors tell themselves when they look in the mirror." As he spoke, Nix continued her work, but her movements had become more deliberate. She wasn't just cleaning anymore. She was listening to every word with focused intensity, cataloging every statement, every admission, every piece of evidence that might lead her closer to the truth about who had murdered her brothers. Ashford pulled out a file folder with hands that trembled slightly. We've identified several potential sources for the leak. All had access to the operational details. All had financial problems that might have motivated them to sell information. Financial problems? Hawthorne asked. What kind of financial problems? Gambling debts, sir. Significant ones. The color drained from Ashford's face as he realized what he had just revealed. His own gambling problem was a closely guarded secret known only to his wife and his bookie, but the implications of his words hung heavy in the air. If they were looking for someone with gambling debts who had access to classified information, the circle of suspects had just narrowed considerably. Blackwood studied each face in the room, looking for tells for signs of guilt or nervousness, but his attention kept returning to Nix, who had gone very still during the discussion of betrayal and financial motivations. Not the stillness of someone trying to be invisible, but the stillness of a predator watching prey. The meeting was interrupted by an emergency alert tone from everyone's secure communications devices. Officers reached for their phones, checking for updates. But Nix also reached into her pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a similar device, though hers was marked with classifications that most of the officers couldn't access. Why does she have a secure communication device? Thornton demanded, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine alarm. Blackwood's suspicion finally boiled over. Years of combat experience of reading situations and making split-second decisions that meant life or death told him that something was profoundly wrong with this entire scenario. He strode across the room and grabbed Nix's arm, his patience completely exhausted. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but it ends now. I want answers, and I want them immediately." The force of his grip caused Nix's sleeve to ride up further, revealing more of the tattoo on her forearm. Blackwood caught a glimpse of black ink that looked like the outline of a weapon. A rifle. But not just any rifle. The distinctive profile of a Barrett M82A1 sniper rifle rendered in incredible detail with what appeared to be hash marks arranged in precise rows beside it. Before he could examine it more closely, Nix pulled her arm free with a movement that was far too smooth, far too practiced, far too efficient to belong to someone without extensive combat training. "Admiral," she said quietly, and there was something new in her voice, something that made every officer in the room stop and pay attention. "I need you to remove your hand, sir." The last word carried weight, authority. The tone of someone who knew military protocol and expected it to be followed. Blackwood stared at the covered tattoo, his tactical mind racing through possibilities. He had seen thousands of military tattoos over his career. Deployment markers, unit insignias, memorial pieces for fallen brothers. But something about the brief glimpse he had gotten seemed significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Before he could pursue it, the meeting was interrupted again. Major Brooks received an urgent message on his device, and his face went pale as he read it. "Sir," Brooks said, his voice tight, "we have updated intelligence from Afghanistan. The investigation into the Ghost Unit ambush has identified new evidence." The room's attention shifted to Brooks as he read from his secure tablet, and for just a moment no one was watching Nix. No one except Sullivan, who saw her hands clench into fists behind her back, saw her breathing change from calm and controlled to something deeper, more deliberate. "According to this report," Brooks continued, "Ghost Unit wasn't just ambushed. They were systematically betrayed by someone with intimate knowledge of their operational procedures. The enemy knew their approach, route, their entry point, their formation, even their individual specializations." Blackwood felt a chill run down his spine despite the comfortable temperature in the conference room. Ghost Unit operations were classified at the highest levels. Very few people would have had access to their specific tactics and procedures. Someone at the highest levels of command had betrayed 7 American soldiers. "What kind of evidence?" Hawthorne asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. "Communication intercepts, sir. The enemy knew exactly when and where Ghost Unit would be, what equipment they were carrying, even which operators were snipers, which were breathers, which were communication specialists. It was complete operational intelligence, the kind you'd only have if someone gave you the entire mission folder." Nix had gone completely motionless during this exchange. Not the nervous stillness of someone trying to hide, but the absolute immobility of a sniper in position, controlling every breath, every muscle, waiting for the perfect moment. Sullivan knew that posture. He taught her that posture. It was the position you took when you were about to change everything. "There's more, sir." Brooks continued, scrolling through his tablet. The report indicates that Ghost Unit had an embedded investigator, someone working undercover to identify the source of previous intelligence leaks in Afghanistan operations. Blackwood's mind was working frantically now, pieces of the puzzle starting to click together in ways that seemed impossible but explained everything. An embedded investigator would have high-level clearance, would have tactical knowledge, would have CIA connections, would have every reason to maintain cover while gathering intelligence. Brooks, Blackwood said, slowly, carefully, as if speaking the words too quickly might somehow make them less real. Does that report identify the embedded investigator? Brooks scrolled through his device, his expression suggesting he was reading something that fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. Partially, sir. It shows the codename Silent Angel and indicates the operative is still active, still investigating the Ghost Unit betrayal. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was processing the implications, but Blackwood's attention was focused entirely on Nyx. Her reaction to the codename had been barely perceptible, but he had caught it. A slight straightening of her shoulders, a brief closing of her eyes as if hearing old words that brought back powerful memories. "Interesting tattoo you have there, miss," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying a new undertone of respect, mixed with something that might have been fear. That looked like a Barrett M82A1 sniper rifle, along with what appeared to be kill markings, 17 of them if I'm not mistaken. Nyx met his eyes for the first time since entering the room, really met them with none of the deference or apology that had characterized her earlier behavior. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying across the conference room with the confidence of someone who had commanded fire teams in combat situations. "Sir, you asked me about my rank earlier." "Yes, I did." "I told you I serve where I'm needed." Blackwood nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "And where exactly are you needed, Miss Calloway?" The room held its collective breath as Nyx seemed to make a decision. Her entire demeanor shifted. The differential service worker facade fell away like a snake, shedding old skin, revealing something much more formidable underneath. Her posture changed. Her eyes changed. Even the air around her seemed to change, charged with the kind of danger that came from someone who had killed 17 human beings from impossible distances and lived with the weight of that knowledge. "Right here, Admiral," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 8 months of investigation and 14 months of grief. "Investigating the murder of my team." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Blackwood felt his world shifting as the full implications of what she had said began to register. The quiet woman he had been dismissing and humiliating for the past 47 minutes was not what she appeared to be, was not even close to what she appeared to be. Ashford had gone pale, his hands shaking visibly as he reached for his water glass. Thornton was staring at Nyx with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. All his earlier mockery turned to ashes in his mouth. Hawthorne looked like he had seen a ghost. Dr. Marlowe's expression carried vindication mixed with concern, and Sullivan, sitting in his corner, allowed himself the smallest smile of satisfaction. His student had maintained her cover perfectly, right up until the moment she chose to break it. "Your team?" Blackwood asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. His tactical mind was racing ahead, understanding the implications faster than his emotions could catch up. "What team?" Nyx's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now. Pain, rage, loss. 8 months of carrying secrets and 14 months of carrying grief. "Ghost Unit 7, sir." She paused, letting the words sink in. 7 operators killed in action due to compromised intelligence. 1 survivor. The confession hit the room like a physical blow. Several officers pushed back from the table, suddenly understanding that everything they thought they knew about the past hour had been wrong. This wasn't a civilian worker who had wandered into a classified briefing. This was a decorated special operations soldier who had been watching them, studying them, gathering evidence against them for 6 months while they treated her like furniture. "You're telling me," Blackwood said slowly, each word deliberate, "that you're the surviving member of Ghost Unit 7. "Yes, sir." "And you're here investigating who betrayed your mission." "Yes, sir." Blackwood looked around the room at his fellow officers, seeing them now as Nyx must see them, as potential traitors, as suspects, as people who might have contributed to the deaths of 7 American soldiers through negligence or deliberate betrayal. "How?" The question came from Major Brooks, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "How did you survive when your entire unit was killed?" Nyx's expression didn't change, but there was something haunting in her eyes as she answered. Something that spoke of watching brothers die through a scope while being powerless to save them. "I was providing overwatch from an elevated position." 2,400 meters from the target compound. Her voice was clinical now, reporting facts rather than emotions. When the ambush began, I maintained position and provided covering fire while requesting immediate extraction for survivors. Were there any? Thornton asked quietly, all his earlier arrogance completely gone. No, sir. By the time the quick reaction force arrived, I was the only one left. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of helicopter rotors outside. Every officer present was grappling with the reality that they had been interrogating a war hero who had watched her entire team die and then spent 8 months infiltrating the Pentagon to find out why. Blackwood sat heavily in his chair, the weight of his behavior over the past hour crushing down on him like physical pressure. He had dismissed her, belittled her, humiliated her, and she had borne it all with quiet dignity because she had a mission, and nothing, not pride, not anger, not the desire to put an arrogant SEAL admiral in his place, was more important than finding justice for her brothers. Miss Calloway, he began, but she interrupted him with a voice that carried authority earned through combat rather than granted through rank. Sergeant Major Calloway, sir. The correction was delivered without malice, but it carried the full weight of her service and sacrifice. And it meant that she outranked several people in the room. That the woman they had been treating like invisible furniture was actually a senior non-commissioned officer with more field experience than most of them combined. Blackwood absorbed that correction like a physical blow. Sergeant Major Calloway, he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice, now respect earned through revelation and shame. I owe you an apology. Sir, Nick said, and her voice carried steel underneath the military courtesy. The apology I need isn't for me. It's for Sergeants Whitaker, Brennan, Garrison, Rafferty, Kirkland, Drummond, and O'Malley. They're the ones who died because someone in this chain of command sold them out. The names hit like individual hammer blows. These weren't just code names or numbers in a report. They were real people with families, friends, lives that had been cut short by betrayal. And everyone in this room was now part of the investigation into that betrayal. Thornton, who had been making jokes about her weapon handling earlier, was now staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The woman he had mocked was a combat veteran who had probably seen more action than he ever would, who had watched her brothers die, who had killed 17 enemy combatants in a desperate attempt to save them. Sergeant Major Hawthorne cleared his throat. If you're investigating this leak, then you must have some idea who might be responsible. Nix's gaze swept the room, stopping briefly on each face before moving on. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of 6 months of patient observation. Sir, I've been observing this command structure for 6 months. During that time, I've documented 17 separate instances of classified information being accessed inappropriately, discussed in unsecured locations, or shared with personnel outside the need-to-know circle. Blackwood felt sick to his stomach. 17 instances. And he suddenly realized that his own casual discussions of classified material, his assumption that everyone in the room was cleared to hear everything, his complete failure to verify Nix's credentials before allowing her to remain during sensitive discussions, all of that was probably documented in whatever evidence she had been gathering. The systematic nature of the security failures suggests either gross negligence or deliberate compromise of classified information, Nix continued. And everyone in this room is potentially implicated. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They weren't just participants in a meeting anymore. They were suspects in a criminal investigation. And the woman they had dismissed and humiliated was the investigator who held their fates in her hands. Outside the conference room, the Pentagon continued its daily operations. Thousands of people moving through corridors, making decisions that shaped military operations around the world, completely unaware that in conference room E7, the entire power dynamic had just undergone a seismic shift. Sergeant Major Nick Silent Angel Calloway stood in the middle of the room, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, finally revealing herself as what she truly was, a decorated warrior on a mission of justice for 7 fallen brothers. And she had just begun to show them exactly how much they had underestimated her. The morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day that reminded Nix of Afghanistan. 14 months ago, on a morning just like this one, she had climbed to her overwatch position at 0300 hours, settled into the rocks with her Barrett, and watched the sun rise over mountains that held death in their shadows. Today, she would face a different kind of enemy. Not insurgents with AK-47s and improvised explosives, but a bureaucrat with a comfortable office and a 16-year career of faithful service to the United States government. A man who had betrayed that service for money, who had traded American lives for retirement security, who had never once had to look through a scope, and watch the consequences of his actions play out in real time. Lawrence Blackwell was about to learn what those consequences looked like. Nick stood in the equipment room adjacent to conference room E7 at 0600 hours, allowing FBI Special Agent Victoria Ramsey to attach the wire. The device was smaller than a shirt button positioned just below her collarbone, where it would pick up her voice clearly while remaining invisible under her uniform. "Audio check," Ramsey said into her communication device. "Copy clear," came Agent Nash's voice through the speakers. "Video feed is optimal. Sergeant Major, when you enter the office, try to position yourself so Blackwell's back is to the window. Best angle on his face that way." "Understood," Nick said, her voice carrying that familiar combat calm that Sullivan had taught her years ago. The door opened and Admiral Blackwood entered, followed by Sullivan, Dr. Marlowe, and Major Brooks. They would observe from the adjacent room, bearing witness to what was about to happen. "Sergeant Major," Blackwood said quietly. "Are you ready?" Nick met his eyes. "I've been ready for 14 months, sir. Since the moment I watched my brothers die and swore I'd find the person responsible." At 0655 hours, Nix walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the personnel office. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing military, but she had adopted a slightly uncertain air, the manner of a junior investigator meeting with a senior administrator. Lawrence Blackwell needed to feel superior, needed to believe he was in control. That arrogance would be his downfall. She knocked on his door at precisely 700 hours. "Come in," came a pleasant, professional voice. Nix entered an office that spoke of comfortable bureaucracy, framed certificates on the walls, family photos on the desk. Lawrence Blackwell sat behind his desk, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the soft build of someone who spent days behind computers rather than in combat zones. He smiled warmly. "Sergeant Major Calloway, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Nix settled into the chair across from his desk, positioning herself so Blackwell's face would be clearly visible to the hidden camera. "Thank you for meeting with me, sir. I know your schedule is busy." "Not at all," Blackwell said, waving dismissively. "When I heard the Inspector General's office was investigating the Ghost Unit incident, I wanted to offer any assistance possible. Terrible tragedy. 7 good men lost." The casual way he spoke about their deaths made Nix's blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral, professional. "Yes, sir, that's what I wanted to discuss. I'm trying to understand how the operational security was compromised." "Of course," Blackwell said, leaning back with the confidence of someone who believed himself beyond suspicion. "I've pulled the relevant personnel files for your review. All 7 operators had appropriate security clearances. Nothing in their profiles suggested security risks." "I appreciate that, sir, but I'm more interested in understanding who had access to those personnel files." Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes, not quite alarm, but a sharpening of attention. "Access to personnel files, that's rather broad, Sergeant Major. Hundreds of people have various levels of access." "But not everyone has unrestricted access," Nix countered gently. "The kind that allows pulling psychological evaluations, financial records, family information. That level is much more limited." "True." Blackwell acknowledged his smile, not quite reaching his eyes now. "Why are you interested in file access rather than the actual security breach?" Nix pulled out her tablet. "Sir, over the past several months, we've identified a pattern. 7 military personnel across 3 commands were approached by foreign intelligence operatives. In each case, the recruitment approach was specifically tailored to that individual's vulnerabilities." She paused, watching his face carefully. "That kind of targeted recruitment requires inside information. Someone had to identify these individuals and provide their personal details to foreign handlers." Blackwell's expression remained neutral, but Nix noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against his desk before stopping. "That's a serious allegation, Sergeant Major. Do you have evidence?" "I do, sir." Nix turned her tablet so he could see the interconnected web of recruitment attempts, dates, and correlations. "And the evidence shows that in every case, the targeted individual's personnel file was accessed approximately 3 weeks before their recruitment approach." "That could be coincidence," Blackwell suggested. "Personnel files are accessed constantly for legitimate reasons." "Except all 7 files were accessed by the same account within that 3-week window," Nix said quietly. "Your account, Mr. Blackwell." The silence was profound. Blackwell's smile disappeared, completely replaced by careful blankness. "My account accesses thousands of files," he said slowly. "I'm the Deputy Director of Personnel Operations. It's literally my job. These particular files were accessed outside normal business hours, late at night, on weekends. and they were open for extended periods much longer than necessary for routine administrative review. Blackwell composed himself, shifting to mild concern. Sergeant Major, I understand you're conducting a thorough investigation, but I'm troubled by the implication. I've served the Department of Defense for 16 years. I'm sure you have, sir. That's what makes this difficult. Because the evidence suggests that someone with your access has been systematically identifying vulnerable military personnel and providing their information to foreign intelligence services. That's absurd, Blackwell said, but there was an edge to his voice now. I would never betray American soldiers. Then help me understand something, sir. Nix leaned forward slightly. 3 weeks before Colonel Ashford was approached by a GRU operative, you accessed his complete personnel file, including financial disclosure forms showing significant gambling debts. Why ball? Blackwell's fingers drummed against his desk again. I don't recall the specific circumstances. I review many files. There was no security clearance update scheduled, Nix said, and his commanding officer made no requests. I checked. She pulled up another screen. Captain Thornton. You accessed his file, including psychological evaluation notes about his need for external validation. 3 weeks later, he was approached by an operative who praised his service. Coincidence? I don't like what you're implying, Sergeant Major, Blackwell said, anger creeping into his voice. You're right, sir. Correlation isn't causation. Nix's voice remained clinical. But when you combine the access pattern with financial records, it becomes more meaningful. She turned her tablet again. Over 18 months, you've received 17 wire transfers from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transfers total $640,000. Each correspond to approximately 1 week after a targeted officer was successfully recruited. Blackwell's face went pale. Those transfers are from investments. Perfectly legal. The account is owned by a shell corporation traced back to a known GRU front company. Nix interrupted. The same organization employing Alexei Volkov, who recruited Thornton and Ashford. Would you like to explain why Russian intelligence has been sending you over $500,000? Blackwell stood abruptly. I want to speak to my attorney. I'm not saying anything else without legal representation. That's your right, sir, Nix said, still seated, still calm. But before you make that call, I want you to understand something. 7 men are dead because of the information you provided. I don't have to listen to this, Blackwell said, reaching for his phone. Sergeant Benjamin Whitaker. Nix continued, her voice cutting through his protest. 24 years old, you accessed his file. You noted his engagement, his clean financial record. Not vulnerable enough, but he died anyway in an ambush that used intelligence only someone with your access could provide. Blackwell's hand hovered over his phone, frozen. You didn't just identify vulnerable soldiers, Mr. Blackwell. You had access to operational planning files, Ghost Unit's mission parameters, their route, their timing, all available to someone with your clearance who knew where to look. I never, Blackwell started, but his voice lacked conviction. You accessed Ghost Unit's operational file 48 hours before their mission. Nix said, emotion breaking through for the first time. You knew where they were going, when, how, and you sold that information to the people who had been paying you for vulnerable targets. I didn't know they'd be killed, Blackwell said, and the admission came out before he could stop it. They said it was just for positioning, for understanding where American forces operated to avoid conflicts. They said no one would get hurt. In the observation room, Ramsey clenched her fist. We have him. Nix took a step closer to Blackwell. You believed Russian intelligence wanted operational details just to avoid conflicts. I needed to believe it, Blackwell said, trembling now. Do you know what it's like working here 16 years watching generals make decisions, costing billions while I process paperwork for government salary? I have 3 kids in college, a mortgage, medical bills from my wife's cancer treatment. The military doesn't pay people like me enough. So you sold out American soldiers to pay your bills, Nix said flatly. I didn't know. Blackwell's voice rose. I thought, let me tell you about consequences, Mr. Blackwell. Nix pulled out her tablet, calling up photographs. This is Sergeant Flynn O'Malley, my spotter, my best friend. I watched him die through my scope from 2,400 meters away. I heard him choking on his own blood, or the radio asking me to tell his mother he wasn't scared. She showed another photograph. Sergeant Mason Kirkland, combat medic, died trying to save Flynn. His last words were, I'm sorry, because he thought he'd failed. Photograph after photograph, face after face. These are your consequences, Mr. Blackwell. 7 funerals, 7 families destroyed because you needed money. Blackwell collapsed into his chair, face in his hands. What do you want from me? I want you to own what you did, Nick said. I want you to say clearly and for the record that you provided classified personnel information and operational planning details to foreign intelligence services. If I confess, I'll spend life in prison, Blackwell said. Yes, Nix agreed. You will. But those 7 men will spend eternity in graves because of what you did. Blackwell looked up, meeting her eyes. Who are you? I'm Sergeant Major Nix Calloway, Ghost Unit 7, the one who survived. The one who spent 14 months tracking down everyone responsible for murdering my brothers. And you're the last name on my list. The truth hit him like a physical blow. You were there. I was 2,400 meters away providing overwatch. I killed 17 enemy combatants trying to save my team. It wasn't enough, because you gave the enemy perfect intelligence. Blackwell was crying now. I'm sorry, God help me, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't bring them back, Nick said, but a confession might prevent it from happening again. How many other files have you sold? 14, Blackwell whispered. Over 18 months. 7 were successfully recruited. In operational information, 3 missions. Ghost Unit was the 3rd. The other 2 resulted in casualties. 4 in the 1st, 3 in the 2nd. His voice was barely audible. 18 American soldiers dead because I needed money. The door opened and Ramsey entered with 2 FBI agents. Lawrence Blackwell, you're under arrest for espionage, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder. As they led him away in handcuffs, Blackwell looked at Nix one final time. What happens now? Now you face justice, Nix said. You'll spend the rest of your life in a maximum security federal prison. And every day you'll remember the 18 soldiers who died because you valued money more than honor. The following 4 months passed in tribunals and testimony. Lawrence Blackwell pleaded guilty in exchange for life without parole rather than the death penalty. Colonel Ashford received 25 years and a dishonorable discharge. But the changes that mattered weren't the sentences, they were the reforms. Admiral Blackwood resigned, but not before implementing comprehensive security protocols based on Nix's investigation. Mandatory clearance verification, 2-person integrity for sensitive file access, regular security audits. He accepted a teaching position at West Point, where he now taught operational security, beginning every class with the story of Ghost Unit 7. Captain Thornton became an instructor at the Marine Corps Counterintelligence School, teaching how I was recruited as a case study. His brutal honesty about his failures made the lessons effective. General Hawthorne, demoted to colonel, developed the Hawthorne protocols for smartphone security in military contexts, adopted military-wide. Major Brooks was promoted to lieutenant colonel with oversight of the new security audit program, ensuring reforms would continue. Dr. Marlowe became deputy director of Pentagon Security, crediting Nix with teaching her that the most important intelligence often came from overlooked people. On a cold morning in March, 6 months after the arrests, Nix stood at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60. 7 graves with white marble headstones bearing names, ranks, and dates. The man who betrayed you is in prison, she said to the graves. Life sentence, no parole. The system that failed you has been reformed. Admiral Blackwood sacrificed his career to make it stick. She knelt beside Flann O'Malley's grave, touching the cold marble. I miss you, you Irish bastard. Miss your terrible jokes. Miss having someone watch my 6 who I trusted completely. She moved to each grave, speaking to each man individually, maintaining the connection death had interrupted, but not severed. The Inspector General offered me a promotion, leading a joint counterintelligence task force. 23 active investigations. She paused. I turned it down. Not because the work isn't important, but because I'm a warrior, not an investigator. I belong in the field training the next generation. She stood, coming to attention. So I accepted master instructor position at Fort Benning Sniper School. I'll train the next generation, passing on everything you taught me, making sure every soldier understands their skills are about bringing their brothers home alive. She rendered a final salute. Your watch is ended, brothers. Mine continues. I swear I will make sure no other sniper ever has to watch their team die while being powerless to save them. As she turned to leave, she found Sullivan waiting at Section 60's edge. Heard you turned down the promotion, Sullivan said. I'm a trigger puller bull. Always have been. Fort Benning is lucky to have you. Those kids won't know what hit them. I'm going to be hard on them. Harder than you were on me, because I know what happens when training isn't rigorous enough. They'll complain. They'll think you're too strict. Good, Nick said. I'd rather they hate me in training and come home alive than like me and die in the field. Fort Benning, Georgia, 3 months later. The sun barely cleared the horizon when Nick stood before her first class. 20 recruits in various stages of uncertainty stood at attention, eyeing her with curiosity. "My name is Sergeant Major Nix Calloway," she began. "You can call me Sergeant Major or Silent Angel. Over the next 12 weeks, I'll teach you how to kill from distances most people can't see clearly. But before we discuss rifles or scopes, you need to understand something fundamental." She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the tattoo. The Barrett M82A1. The 17 hash marks. The student's eyes widened. "It's not about the rifle. It's not about the scope. It's about bringing your brothers home." She rolled up her right sleeve, showing 7 names. "These are my team. Ghost Unit 7. They died 14 months ago because of compromised intelligence and security failures. I was providing overwatch from 2,400 meters. I killed 17 trying to save them. It wasn't enough." The silence was absolute. "I tell you this so you understand the stakes. Why I'll be harder on you than any instructor you've ever had. Because someday you'll be in that position and someone's life will depend on whether you remembered your training." She looked down the line. "If you're here because you think being a sniper is cool, leave now. This isn't about glory, it's about responsibility. The responsibility of taking life. The responsibility of protecting your brothers. The responsibility of living with every shot you take and every shot you miss." No one moved. "One more thing. At the end of every day, we take 5 minutes to remember why we're here. We remember Sergeant Benjamin Whitaker, Sergeant Lucas Brennan, Sergeant Tyler Garrison, Sergeant Connor Rafferty, Sergeant Mason Kirkland, Sergeant Isaac Drummond, Sergeant Flynn O'Malley, 7 warriors who died because the system failed them. We train so the system never fails anyone again." The students repeated the names, uncertain at first, then stronger. Over 12 weeks, Nix drove them harder than they'd ever been driven. She demanded perfection, made them hold positions until muscles screamed, woke them at 0300 for surprise drills, failed them for errors others might overlook. By week 620 had become 14. The remaining 14 were harder, sharper, more precise. Private Emma Reeves particularly caught Nix's attention. 19 barely meeting height requirements, but she could shoot. After a grueling range day, Nix found her still cleaning her rifle. "Private Reeves, why are you still here?" Reeves stood at attention. "Making sure my rifle is properly maintained, Sergeant Major. Tomorrow's qualification. I want to be ready." "You're doing well. Best in class for wind reading." "Thank you, Sergeant Major." Reeves hesitated. "The 7 names on your arm. Do you think about them every day, Anzawam?" "Every single day, Private. Every morning, every night. They're with me constantly." "Does it get easier?" "No, but it gets more bearable. You learn to carry the weight. You make sure their deaths meant something by being the best instructor possible. When I graduate, I want to be the kind of sniper who brings everyone home." "Then you're in the right place, Private. Keep working." On graduation day, Nick stood before her class in dress uniform. They were no longer uncertain recruits. They were qualified snipers ready for deployment. "You've earned the right to wear the sniper tab," Nick said. "But the real test happens in the field when lives depend on your skills and judgment." She moved down the line, pinning tabs on each uniform. When she reached Reeves, she paused. "Outstanding work, Private. You've earned this." "Thank you, Sergeant Major. I won't let you down." "I know you won't, because I trained you not to." After the ceremony, Nix returned to her office. On the wall hung a photograph of 7 men in combat gear. Ghost Unit 7, 3 weeks before Kandahar. "I kept my promise, brothers," she said quietly. "I found who betrayed you, made sure he faced justice. Now I'm making sure every sniper who graduates understands the responsibility they carry." Her phone buzzed. "Sullivan, heard your class graduated. 14 out of 20. Well done, Angel." She smiled, typing back, 14 warriors who will bring their teams home. That's all that matters." As sunset cast long shadows across Fort Benning, Nick stood at her office window, looking at the ranges where she'd begin training a new class in 2 weeks. The work continued. It would always continue. There would always be new threats, new missions, new soldiers who needed skills and mindset to survive and bring their brothers home. Ghost Unit 7 was gone, but their legacy lived on in every student Nix trained, in every life those students would save, in every mission succeeding, because somewhere a sniper provided overwatch with the dedication that turned invisible warriors into guardian angels. Sergeant Major Nix Silent Angel Calloway had lost her brothers, hunted their killer. brought him to justice. Now she spent every day ensuring no other sniper would watch their team die while powerless to save them. It wasn't closure. It wasn't healing. It was purpose. And for a warrior like Nick's, purpose was enough. She touched her tattoo one final time, tracing the 7 names marking her skin and soul. Watch over them, brothers. Watch over every soldier I train. Help me make sure they all come home. The wind carried her words across the training grounds, across ranges where future warriors would learn precision and patience, across the invisible line between living and dead, where promises were made and kept. Silent Angel's mission was complete. Her duty would never end. In the gathering darkness, Nix prepared for tomorrow. Another class, another group of young soldiers who would learn that being a sniper wasn't about the rifle or the distance or the confirmed kills. It was about the warriors you protected, the brothers you brought home, the sacred responsibility of watching over those who trusted you to keep them safe. That was the lesson Ghost Unit 7 had taught her through their deaths. That was the lesson she would teach through the rest of her life. The Silent Angel's watch continued. And it would continue as long as soldiers needed someone watching over them from positions the enemy never saw, with skills they never matched, protecting brothers and sisters who never knew the Guardian's name. Justice had been served. But the mission, the real mission of bringing warriors home, would never truly end. And Nix Calloway wouldn't have it any other way. The morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day that reminded Nix of Afghanistan. 14 months ago, on a morning just like this one, she had climbed to her overwatch position at 0300 hours, settled into the rocks with her Barrett, and watched the sun rise over mountains that held death in their shadows. Today she would face a different kind of enemy. Not insurgents with AK-47s and improvised explosives, but a bureaucrat with a comfortable office and a 16-year career of faithful service to the United States government. A man who had betrayed that service for money, who had traded American lives for a comfortable retirement fund, who had never once had to look through a scope and watch the consequences of his actions play out in real time. Lawrence Blackwell was about to learn what those consequences looked like. Nick stood in the small equipment room adjacent to Conference Room E7, allowing FBI Special Agent Victoria Ramsey to attach the wire. The device was smaller than Nix had expected, no larger than a button positioned just below her collarbone, where it would pick up her voice clearly while remaining invisible under her uniform. "Audio check," Ramsey said, speaking into her own communication device. "Bravo 1, do you copy?" "Copy clear," came Agent Nash's voice through the speakers. He was in the observation room with the technical equipment monitoring both audio and the hidden camera that had been installed in Blackwell's office overnight. "Video feed is optimal. Sergeant Major, when you enter the office, try to position yourself so Blackwell has his back to the window. That'll give us the best angle on his face." "Understood," Nick said. Her voice was calm, controlled, showing none of the tension that Sergeant Major Sullivan would have recognized in the set of her shoulders. The door opened, and Admiral Blackwood entered, followed by Sullivan, Dr. Marlowe, Major Brooks, and several other officers who had been present for yesterday's revelations. They would all be in the observation room, bearing witness to what was about to happen. "Sergeant Major," Blackwood said quietly, "are you ready for this?" Nix met his eyes. "I've been ready for 14 months, sir. Since the moment I watched my brothers die and swore I'd find the person responsible." "Blackwell is a civilian administrator," Blackwood cautioned. "He's not a soldier. He won't have the same code of honor we do. He might not confess even when confronted with evidence." "Then I'll make him confess," Nick said simply. "I spent 6 years learning how to read people from 2,000 meters away. Reading someone across a desk will be simple by comparison." Ramsey finished the final equipment check. "You're live, Sergeant Major. Remember, we need him to explicitly admit to providing classified personnel information to foreign intelligence services. Implications aren't enough. We need clear, unambiguous statements that will hold up in federal court." "He'll confess," Nick said, with the certainty of someone who had spent months planning this moment. "One way or another, Lawrence Blackwell is going to tell me exactly what he did and why he did it." At 0655 hours, Nix left the equipment room and walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the personnel office. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing military, but she had adopted a slightly uncertain air, the manner of a junior investigator meeting with a senior administrator. Lawrence Blackwell needed to feel superior, needed to believe he was in control. That arrogance would be his downfall. The personnel office was located in a quieter section of the Pentagon, away from the operational commands, where real decisions about war and peace were made. It was a place of files and databases of background checks and security clearances, of the mundane administrative work that kept the military machine functioning. And it was from this place that American soldiers had been systematically betrayed. Nix knocked on Blackwell's door at precisely 0700 hours. "Come in," came a voice from inside. Pleasant, professional, completely unremarkable. Nix opened the door and stepped into an office that spoke of comfortable bureaucracy. Framed certificates on the walls. Family photos on the desk showing a wife and 3 college-age children. A window overlooking one of the Pentagon's internal courtyards. Lawrence Blackwell sat behind his desk, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the soft build of someone who spent their days behind a computer rather than in the field. He smiled as she entered, the warm smile of someone who believed himself completely safe. "Sergeant Major Calloway, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Nix settled into the chair across from his desk, positioning herself so that Blackwell's face would be clearly visible to the hidden camera. "Thank you for meeting with me, sir. I know your schedule is busy." "Not at all, not at all," Blackwell said, waving his hand dismissively. "When I heard the Inspector General's office was investigating the Ghost Unit incident, I wanted to offer any assistance I could. Terrible tragedy, that ambush. 7 good men lost." The casual way he spoke about their deaths made Nix's blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral, professional. This was a sniper mission, and the target had just confirmed he was in position. "Yes, sir, that's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. I'm trying to understand how the operational security was compromised." Of course," Blackwell said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed himself beyond suspicion. "I've pulled the relevant personnel files for your review. All 7 operators had appropriate security clearances. Background checks were current. Nothing in their profiles suggested any security risk." "I appreciate that, sir, but I'm actually more interested in understanding who had access to those personnel files in the weeks before the ambush." Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes. Not quite alarm, but a sharpening of attention, like a deer catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. "Access to personnel files. That's a rather specific question, Sergeant Major. May I ask what prompted this line of inquiry?" "Pattern recognition, sir," Nix said, pulling out her tablet with practiced casualness. "Over the past several months, I've been investigating not just the Ghost Unit breach, but a series of security incidents across multiple commands. And I've discovered something interesting." She turned the tablet so he could see the screen showing the web of connections she had documented. Names, dates, recruitment approaches, all linked in a pattern that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. 7 military personnel across 3 different commands were approached by foreign intelligence operatives. Nix continued, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone presenting evidence. In each case, the recruitment approach was specifically tailored to that individual's personal vulnerabilities. Financial problems, family issues, career disappointments, psychological stressors. Blackwell's expression remained neutral, but Nix noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against his desk before stopping. These were Tell's micro-expressions that revealed stress beneath the calm exterior. "That's concerning," Blackwell said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand what this has to do with Ghost Unit specifically." "I'm getting to that, sir," Nix said. "You see, that kind of targeted recruitment requires inside information. Someone had to identify these individuals as potential assets and provide detailed personal information to foreign handlers. And the evidence shows that in every case, the targeted individual's personnel file was accessed approximately 3 weeks before their recruitment approach. Personnel files are accessed all the time for legitimate reasons," Blackwell suggested, but there was a new quality to his voice now. A carefulness that hadn't been there before. "Promotion reviews, transfer requests, routine security updates. You can't assume that file access equals malicious intent." "You're absolutely right, sir," Nix agreed, "which is why I didn't make any assumptions. Instead, I documented the pattern and cross-referenced it with financial records, communication logs, and travel patterns." She pulled up another screen on her tablet, showing access logs that Agent Nash had compiled overnight. These 7 files were all accessed outside normal business hours, late at night, on weekends, and they were open for extended periods much longer than would be necessary for routine administrative review. In the observation room, Ramsey leaned forward, watching Blackwell's reaction on the video feed. "She's good," the FBI agent murmured to Nash. "She's building the case methodically, giving him rope to hang himself with." On screen, Blackwell had shifted in his chair, his body language becoming more defensive. "Sergeant Major, I have to say I'm troubled by what you're implying. I've served the Department of Defense for 16 years with distinction. My entire career has been dedicated to supporting our military personnel. I'm sure it has, sir, Nick said, and her voice carried no accusation, just calm statement of fact. That's what makes this pattern so significant, because the evidence suggests that someone with your level of access and authority has been systematically identifying vulnerable military personnel and providing their information to foreign intelligence services. That's absurd, Blackwell said, but there was an edge to his voice now. The very suggestion is offensive. I would never betray American soldiers. Then help me understand something, sir. Nix leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Blackwell's. 3 weeks before Colonel Preston Ashford was approached by a GRU operative at Murphy's Tavern, you accessed his complete personnel file, including his financial disclosure forms showing significant gambling debts. His file hadn't been accessed in over 8 months prior to that. Why would you suddenly need to review his financial situation? Blackwell's fingers drummed against his desk again, a nervous gesture he seemed unaware of making. I review hundreds of files. I don't recall the specific circumstances of every access. Perhaps there was a security clearance update. Perhaps it was requested by his commanding officer. There was no security clearance update scheduled, Nick said, and his commanding officer made no request for file access during that period. NSA verified this yesterday. She pulled up another screen. Captain Wade Thornton. You accessed his file, including psychological evaluation notes about his need for external validation and recognition. 3 weeks later, he was approached by an operative who praised his service and offered him recognition. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davies. You accessed her file showing marital problems and financial stress. 3 weeks later, she was offered money to help with a consulting project. Blackwell stood abruptly, moving to the window with his back to Nix. It was a defensive posture, removing himself from direct eye contact, but it also positioned him exactly where the hidden camera had optimal angle on his face. I think you're seeing patterns where none exist, Sergeant Major, he said, staring out at the courtyard. Correlation is not causation. Any first-year statistics student knows that. You're absolutely right, sir, Nix agreed. Correlation isn't causation. But when you combine the file access pattern with financial records, the correlation becomes much more meaningful. She stood as well, moving to stand beside her tablet so Blackwell would have to turn to see what she was showing. When he did turn, his face was fully visible to the camera. Over the past 18 months, Nix continued, you've received 17 wire transfers from an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The transfers total $640,000. Each transfer corresponds to a date approximately 1 week after a targeted military officer was successfully recruited by foreign intelligence. Blackwell's face had gone pale. Those transfers are from investments. Perfectly legal financial. The account sending the transfers is owned by a shell corporation. Nix interrupted quietly. Our financial forensics team traced it through 3 layers of dummy companies before identifying the actual source. A known GRU front company. The same organization that employs Alexei Volkov, the operative who recruited Captain Thornton and Colonel Ashford. She paused, letting that information sink in. Mr. Blackwell, why is a Russian intelligence front company sending you over $500,000? The silence that followed was profound. Blackwell remained standing at the window, his back rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier warmth. I want to speak to my attorney. I'm not saying anything else without legal representation. That's certainly your right, sir, Nick said, still calm, still professional. But before you make that call, I want you to understand something. She walked around the desk, positioning herself between Blackwell and the door, not blocking his exit, but making her presence impossible to ignore. 7 men died because of information you provided, she said, and now there was emotion in her voice for the first time. Controlled emotion, but unmistakable. I know you accessed Ghost Unit's operational files 48 hours before their mission. I know you had access to their route, their timing, their equipment, load, their individual specializations. And I know that information was passed to the same people who had been paying you for vulnerable personnel targets. I never meant for anyone to die, Blackwell said, and the words came out before he could stop them. A crack in his defensive wall, a moment of truth breaking through calculated silence. In the observation room, Ramsey clenched her fist in victory. That's an admission, not complete, but it's a start. Nix heard it too, that first acknowledgement of guilt. She pressed forward, voice still controlled, but carrying the weight of 14 months of grief and investigation. You never meant for anyone to die, she repeated. But you knew there was a possibility. You had to know. Russian intelligence doesn't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for information they plan to ignore. They said it was just for positioning. Blackwell's voice was barely above a whisper now. For understanding where American forces were operating so they could avoid conflicts. They said the information would prevent incidents, not cause them. And you believe that, Nix asked. You actually believe that Russian intelligence wanted detailed American operational information to avoid conflicts? I needed to believe it, Blackwell said, and he turned from the window to face her directly. Do you have any idea what it's like? Working here for 16 years, watching generals and admirals make decisions that cost billions? While I process paperwork for a government salary, I have 3 kids in college. Medical bills from my wife's cancer treatment. A mortgage. The military doesn't pay people like me enough to live the life I've earned. So you sold out American soldiers to pay your bills, Nick said flatly. You traded lives for tuition payments. I didn't know they'd use the information that way. Blackwell's voice rose defensive and desperate. I thought it was just intelligence gathering, background information. You never thought about the consequences, Nix interrupted. You never let yourself think about what happens when you give America's enemies detailed information about our operations and our people. She pulled out her tablet again, calling up photographs that she had carried with her since Afghanistan. Let me show you the consequences, Mr. Blackwell. Let me show you exactly what your need for extra money come. She held up the first photograph. A young man in combat gear smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who believed he had a future. This is Sergeant Benjamin Whitaker, 24 years old. You accessed his file, noted he wasn't vulnerable enough for recruitment, but he died in the ambush anyway. The IED that killed him was placed on the exact route his team was taking, a route that was only known to people with access to operational planning. People like you. Blackwell's face twisted with something that might have been pain or might have been guilt. But Nix didn't stop. She had waited 14 months for this moment, and she would make him see every face, understand every cost. Sergeant Lucas Brennan, 32 years old, 3 young children who will grow up without a father. Sergeant Tyler Garrison, 29, 6 months from retirement. Had a teaching job lined up because he wanted to help kids understand what service really means. She showed photograph after photograph, each one a face that had been alive and full of potential before Blackwell's betrayal had stolen their futures. Sergeant Connor Rafferty, 27, sent half his pay home to support his mother fighting cancer. She died 3 months after he did. The grief accelerated her decline, so your information killed them both. Blackwell had sunk into his chair, his face in his hands, but Nix continued relentlessly. Sergeant Mason Kirkland, combat medic, 47 lives saved across 4 deployments. He died trying to treat the wounded even after taking a round through his own leg. Sergeant Isaac Drummond spoke 4 languages. Taught English to village children because he believed education built bridges between cultures. She paused, her voice catching slightly before she forced it steady again. And Sergeant Flynn O'Malley, 28 years old, my spotter, my best friend, the man who was supposed to be best man at my wedding. I listened to him die over the radio from 2,400 meters away. I heard him drowning in his own blood while I was powerless to do anything except keep shooting and hoping it would somehow be enough. The silence in Blackwell's office was absolute. Through the wire, Ramsey and the others in the observation room could hear Blackwell's ragged breathing, the sound of a man confronting the human cost of decisions he had made in abstraction. These are your consequences, Mr. Blackwell. Nix said, her voice steady again, controlled, dangerous. 7 funerals, 7 flag-draped coffins, 7 families who got a knock on the door and learned their son, their brother, their father wasn't coming home because you needed money for college tuition and medical bills. I didn't know, Blackwell whispered through his hands. God help me, I didn't let myself know. But you knew you were providing classified information to foreign intelligence. Nix pressed. You knew the money was coming from Russia. You knew that what you were doing was illegal and dangerous. You just convinced yourself the consequences wouldn't be your responsibility. Blackwell looked up, his face wet with tears. What do you want from me? I want the truth, Nix said. I want you to say clearly, and for the record, that you provided classified personnel information and operational planning details to foreign intelligence services. I want you to name your contacts, describe your methods, and explain exactly how many American soldiers you put at risk. If I confess, I'll spend the rest of my life in prison, Blackwell said. Yes, Nix agreed without hesitation. You will. Federal supermax, probably in solitary confinement for your own protection. Because if you're ever in general population, The other inmates will learn you're the man who sold out American soldiers. And they'll make sure every remaining day you have is filled with the kind of suffering those 18 men experienced when they died. 18. Blackwell's voice cracked. You said 7. Ghost Unit was the third mission where your information resulted in casualties, Nick said coldly. 4 soldiers died in the first incident, 3 in the second, 11 total before my 7 brothers. 18 American warriors dead because you valued money more than lives. Blackwell's face crumpled completely. The mask of professional bureaucrats shattered, revealing a man confronting the magnitude of what he had done. I didn't know about the others. I saw casualty reports, but I never confirmed it was because of my information. I told myself it couldn't be, that it was coincidence. But you suspected, Nick said, and you kept taking the money anyway. The door to Blackwell's office opened and Special Agent Ramsey entered, followed by 2 FBI agents in tactical gear. Lawrence Blackwell, you're under arrest for espionage, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Ramsey read him his rights, Blackwell looked at Nix one final time. Who are you? Really, mushing. I'm Sergeant Major Nix Calloway, she said, Ghost Unit 7. The one who survived, the one who spent 14 months tracking down everyone responsible for murdering my brothers. And you're the last name on my list, Mr. Blackwell. The truth hit him like a physical blow. You were there. You were at the ambush. I was 2,400 meters away providing overwatch, Nix confirmed. I killed 17 enemy combatants trying to save my team. It wasn't enough, because someone had given the enemy perfect intelligence about where we'd be and when we'd be there. That someone was you. The FBI agents cuffed Blackwell and led him toward the door. As they passed through it, Admiral Blackwood Sullivan and the others emerged from the observation room. Blackwood approached Nix, and there was something like awe in his expression. Sergeant Major, that was the most effective interrogation I've ever witnessed. You got him to confess to everything without ever raising your voice or making a direct threat. I didn't need threats, sir, Nix said quietly. I just needed him to understand the human cost of what he did. Abstract numbers don't move people, but names and faces and stories, those cut through any defense. Major Brooks stepped forward. Sergeant Major, we heard everything through the audio feed. Blackwell admitted to 18 deaths, systematic betrayal over 18 months, and taking over $500,000 from Russian intelligence. His confession is airtight. Good, Nix said, because those 18 soldiers deserve justice, and their families deserve to know that the person responsible has been held accountable. The following 4 months passed in a blur of tribunals, depositions, and testimony. Lawrence Blackwell pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. He provided detailed information about his Russian handlers, his payment methods, and the specific information he had compromised over 18 months of betrayal. Colonel Preston Ashford received 25 years in military prison and a dishonorable discharge. His cooperation in exposing the recruitment network reduced what would have been a life sentence. Captain Wade Thornton received a 10-year sentence, also reduced for cooperation. 3 other officers received various sentences for security violations, ranging from negligence to deliberate information sharing. But the changes that mattered most to Nix weren't the sentences. They were the reforms. Admiral Garrison Blackwood resigned his commission 3 weeks after Ashford's sentencing, accepting full responsibility for the security failures that had occurred under his command. But resignation wasn't the end of his story. 6 months later, he accepted a teaching position at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he taught a mandatory course on operational security to every senior cadet. His first lecture always began the same way, with the story of Ghost Unit 7 and how arrogance and assumptions had gotten 7 good men killed. Former students reported that Admiral Blackwood's brutal honesty about his own failures made the lessons far more effective than any textbook could achieve. Captain Thornton, after completing his reduced sentence, became an instructor at the Marine Corps Counterintelligence School. He taught a course called Anatomy of Recruitment, a personal case study, using his own experience with Alexei Volkov as a real-world example of how foreign intelligence services identified and exploited vulnerabilities. His students appreciated his candor, and his course became one of the most highly rated in the counterintelligence curriculum. General Everett Hawthorne, demoted to colonel and transferred to a training command, spent his remaining years in uniform, developing comprehensive smartphone security protocols for military personnel. The Hawthorne protocols, as they became known, addressed everything from encrypted communications to secure photography practices. They were adopted military-wide and significantly reduced unauthorized capture of classified materials on personal devices. Major Brooks, who had been one of the few officers to show Nick's respect from the beginning, was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given oversight of the new security audit program. He reported directly to the Inspector General, ensuring that the reforms Admiral Blackwood had initiated would continue long after Blackwood's resignation. Brooks made a point of crediting Nick's investigation as the catalyst for institutional change, and he frequently invited her to speak at security conferences about the importance of maintaining vigilance, even in trusted environments. Dr. Sienna Marlowe, the civilian analyst, who had defended Nix when everyone else dismissed her, was promoted to Deputy Director of Pentagon Security. In her new role, she implemented comprehensive changes to how civilian analysts were integrated into military planning processes, ensuring their expertise was valued rather than dismissed. She credited Nix with teaching her that the most important intelligence often came from sources that others overlooked. But for Nix, the most meaningful moment came on a cold morning in March, 6 months after Blackwell's arrest, when she stood at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 60, where America's newest heroes rested in precise rows of white marble. She had come here regularly over the past months, but today felt different. Today brought a kind of closure she hadn't thought possible. I know I've said this before. She began speaking to 7 graves as naturally as she would have spoken to living men. But I need to say it one more time. Lawrence Blackwell is in federal prison. Life sentence, no possibility of parole. He confessed to everything. 18 soldiers died because of his betrayal, and he's going to spend the rest of his life knowing that no punishment will ever equal what he took from all of you. The wind carried cherry blossoms across the cemetery early spring, returning life to the world even in this place of death and memory. The system that failed you has been reformed, Nix continued. New security protocols, better oversight, mandatory training on recognizing recruitment attempts. Admiral Blackwood sacrificed his career to make sure the changes stuck. He sends me monthly reports showing implementation progress across all military branches. He's making sure your deaths resulted in something meaningful. She knelt beside Flynn O'Malley's grave, her hand resting on the cold marble. I miss you, you Irish bastard. Miss your terrible jokes and worse poetry. Miss the way you could read wind conditions better than anyone I've ever known. Miss having someone watch my 6, who I trusted completely, without question or hesitation. Nix moved to each grave in turn, spending time with each fallen brother, sharing memories and updates, maintaining the connection that death had interrupted, but not severed. When she reached Benjamin Whitaker's grave, she pulled a small box from her jacket. Ben, I visited Sarah last month. Your fiancée. She's doing better. Still misses you every day, but she's moving forward with her life the way you would have wanted. She asked me to leave this with you. Nix placed the box at the base of the headstone. Inside was the engagement ring, polished and gleaming, that Sarah had carried for 14 months before finally accepting that holding on to it was holding on to grief. She wanted you to have it, Nix said softly, said that her future is ahead of her now, but this belongs with you, part of the life you planned together, staying with you forever. She stood saluting the 7 graves with precise military bearing. Your watch is ended, brothers. Mine continues. But I swear to you, on everything we shared and everything we lost, I will make sure no other sniper has to watch their team die through a scope while being powerless to save them. As Nix lowered her salute, she found Sergeant Major Sullivan waiting at the edge of Section 60, maintaining a respectful distance until she was ready. Heard you turned down the promotion, Sullivan said as she approached. The Counterintelligence Task Force position, Nix confirmed, leading 23 active investigations into potential security breaches. The IG was disappointed. They thought you were perfect for the role. Maybe I would have been, Nix acknowledged, but it's not who I am. I'm a warrior bull, a trigger puller. I belong in the field training the next generation, not behind a desk in Washington chasing leads. Sullivan nodded, understanding in his weathered features. Fort Benning is lucky to have you. Those kids won't know what hit them when you start teaching. I'm going to be hard on them, Nix said. Harder than you were on me, probably. Because I know what happens when training isn't rigorous enough. When standards slip, when we forget that every detail can mean the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins. They'll complain, Sullivan predicted. Think you're too strict, too demanding, too focused on perfection. Well, good, Nix said firmly. I'd rather they hate me in training and survive in combat than like me and die in the field because I didn't prepare them adequately. 3 months later, Fort Benning Sniper School, Georgia. The sun was barely above the horizon when Nix stood before her first class of sniper students. 20 recruits ranging in age from 19 to 34, all volunteers for one of the most demanding training programs in the military. They stood at attention in the pre-dawn light, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. She was younger than most instructors, only 29 years old, but the master sergeant rank on her uniform and the way she carried herself suggested experience far beyond her years. "My name is Sergeant Major Nix Calloway," she began, her voice carrying across the early morning stillness. "You can call me Sergeant Major or you can call me Silent Angel, which was my operational call sign. You cannot call me anything less formal than that." She began walking down the line of students, her eyes evaluating each one with the attention of someone who could read character in posture and expression. "Over the next 12 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to kill human beings from distances most people can't even see clearly. Wind, reading elevation, compensation range, estimation, target identification, and dozens of other skills that separate adequate marksmanship from precision elimination." She stopped, turning to face them all. "But before we discuss any technical skills, I need you to understand something fundamental. Being a sniper isn't about the rifle. It's not about the scope. It's not even about making the perfect shot." Nix rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the full extent of her tattoo. The Barrett M82A1 with its 17 hash marks. The combat deployment markers. The students' eyes widened as they understood what they were seeing. "Being a sniper is about one thing," Nix continued, her voice carrying a conviction born from loss and purpose. "Bringing your brothers home alive. Every shot you take, every position you hold, every hour you spend watching through a scope, it's all in service of protecting the soldiers who depend on you." She rolled up her right sleeve, showing the 7 names in memorial script. "These are the names of my team, Ghost Unit 7. They died 14 months ago in Afghanistan because of compromised intelligence and security failures. I was providing overwatch from 2,400 meters. I killed 17 enemy combatants trying to save them. It wasn't enough." The silence was profound. 20 young soldiers staring at a sergeant major who had lived through their worst nightmare. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," Nix said. "I tell you this so you understand why I'm going to demand absolute perfection in every calculation, every shot, every moment of training. Because someday you'll be in an overwatch position and someone's life will depend on whether you remembered your lessons." She looked down the line, meeting each student's eyes in turn. "If you're here because you think being a sniper looks cool, or because you want to be a hero, or because you enjoyed a movie about snipers, then leave now. This isn't about glory or recognition. It's about responsibility. The responsibility of taking human life. The responsibility of protecting your brothers and sisters. The responsibility of living with every shot you make and every shot you miss." No one moved. They were locked in committed understanding for the first time what this training truly meant. Over the following weeks, Nix drove her students harder than any of them had ever been pushed. She demanded ballistic calculations to 3 decimal places. She made them hold shooting positions until muscles trembled with fatigue. She woke them at 0300 hours for surprise drills. She failed students for errors that other instructors might have overlooked. And slowly, grudgingly, they became better, sharper, more precise, more aware of the weight of responsibility they were accepting. By week 6, the class had narrowed from 20 students to 14. 6 had dropped out, unable to maintain the standards Nix demanded, but the remaining 14 were transforming into something remarkable. One student particularly caught Nix's attention. Private First Class Emma Reeves, 19 years old, fresh from basic training. Small enough that she barely met height requirements and initially facing skepticism from some male students about whether she belonged in sniper training. But she could shoot, and more importantly, she understood the responsibility. After a particularly grueling day on the 1,000-meter range, Nix found Reeves alone, meticulously cleaning her rifle long after the other students had returned to barracks. "Private Reeves," Nix said, approaching quietly. "Why are you still here?" Reeves stood, immediately coming to attention. "Sergeant Major, making sure my rifle is properly maintained for tomorrow's qualification." "At ease," Nix said. "You're doing well, Private. Best wind reader in the class." "Thank you, Sergeant Major." Reeves hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The men on your arm, the 7 names. Do you think about them every day?" Barried him. Nix was quiet for a moment, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the tattoo. "Every single day, Private. Every morning when I wake up, every night before I sleep. They're with me constantly." "Does it get easier?" "No," Nix said with unflinching honesty. "It doesn't get easier, but it becomes more bearable. You learn to carry the weight. You learn to channel the grief into purpose. You honor them by being the best instructor you can be by training the next generation so thoroughly that they come home alive. Reeves nodded, absorbing the wisdom. When I graduate Sergeant Major, I want to be the kind of sniper who brings everyone home, the way you tried to do. Then keep working, Private, keep learning, and never forget that every shot matters, every calculation matters, every moment of preparation matters. Because somewhere, someday, soldiers you've never met will be alive because you were trained well enough to protect them. The weeks continued. Training intensified. 14 students became warriors who understood not just the technical aspects of long-range precision shooting, but the moral weight of the responsibility they carried. On graduation day, Nick stood before her class one final time. They wore dress uniforms, now no longer the uncertain recruits who had arrived 12 weeks earlier. They were qualified snipers, ready for deployment, ready to take their places in the invisible line of guardians who protected others from positions the enemy never saw. You've completed the training, Nick said. You've earned the right to wear the sniper tab. But the real test doesn't happen here on controlled ranges with known distances and ideal conditions. It happens in combat when lives depend on your skills and your judgment. She paused, her eyes moving across each graduate. Remember what I told you on day one? It's not about the rifle. It's not about the scope or the perfect shot or the confirmed kill statistics. It's about bringing your brothers and sisters home alive. That's the mission. That's always the mission. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks had driven down from Washington to attend. Admiral Blackwood, now Professor Blackwood at West Point, had flown in specifically for this ceremony. Sullivan sat in the front row, his weathered face showing unmistakable pride. The graduates stood at attention as Nix moved down the line, pinning the sniper tab on each uniform. When she reached Private Reeves, she paused. Outstanding work, Private. You've earned this. Thank you, Sergeant Major, Reeves said, and there were tears streaming down her face. I won't let you down. I won't let them down. She glanced at Nix's visible tattoo at the 7 names that represented the standard these new snipers would carry forward. I know you won't, Nix said quietly, because I trained you not to fail. After the ceremony, as graduates celebrated with family and friends, Nix returned to her office. On the wall hung a photograph she looked at every day. 7 men in combat gear standing together before a mission, smiling with the easy confidence of warriors who trusted each other completely. Ghost Unit 7, 3 weeks before the Kandahar ambush. I kept my promise, brothers, she said to the photograph. Blackwell is in prison for life. The reforms are in place. And I just graduated 14 new snipers who understand that bringing their teams home is more important than any personal glory. Her phone buzzed. A text from Admiral Blackwood. Just watched your graduation ceremony via video link. Those 14 soldiers are lucky to have you as their instructor. Your brothers would be proud. She typed back, they were the warriors. I'm just making sure their legacy continues. Another message, this time from Private Reeves, now formerly a qualified sniper. Thank you, Sergeant Major, for everything you taught us, for showing us what it means to serve with honor and purpose. Nick smiled, a rare, genuine expression of satisfaction. This was why she taught. This was why she pushed so hard, demanded so much, accepted nothing less than excellence. Because every sniper who graduated from her program carried forward the lessons learned from Ghost Unit 7's sacrifice. As the sun set over Fort Benning, casting long shadows across the ranges where future warriors would train, Nix touched her tattoo one final time. Watch over them, brothers, she whispered to the memorial names. Watch over every soldier I train. Help me make sure they all come home. The wind carried her words across the training grounds, across the firing ranges, where precision was practiced and perfected, across the invisible line between the living and the dead, where promises were made and kept and renewed with every sunrise. 7 warriors had died because of betrayal and negligence. But their deaths had sparked reforms that would protect thousands of soldiers in the years to come. Their memory lived on in every student Nix trained, in every protocol that Admiral Blackwood taught at West Point, in every security briefing that Lieutenant Colonel Brooks conducted. Lawrence Blackwell would spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison, his comfortable bureaucratic existence replaced by a concrete cell, and the knowledge that 18 families would never forgive him. Colonel Ashford served his sentence, knowing that his cooperation had helped expose a systematic recruitment network, but could never redeem his betrayal. And Sergeant Major Nick Silent Angel Calloway stood on the ranges of Fort Benning, training the next generation of warriors, ensuring that Ghost Unit 7's sacrifice would echo through military history as the catalyst for change that saved countless lives. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could bring back 7 brothers who had died too young, too far from home, betrayed by the very system they had sworn to defend. But it was justice, and it was purpose, and it was a promise kept. Silent Angel's mission was complete, but her duty would never end. In the gathering darkness, Nyx walked across the training grounds one final time, her shadow long in the fading light. Tomorrow would bring a new class of students, new faces, new warriors who would carry forward the lessons written in blood and loss, and the determination to ensure that no soldier died because someone valued money more than lives. The watch continued. It would always continue. And as long as Sergeant Major Nyx Calloway drew breath, as long as she could stand on a range and teach young soldiers the difference between adequate and excellent, as long as she could share the names of 7 brothers who deserved to be remembered, the legacy of Ghost Unit 7 would live on. Not in monuments or medals, but in every sniper who learned to value their team's survival above personal glory. In every security protocol that prevented betrayal. In every reform that closed the gaps through which enemies had once struck. In every soldier who came home alive because someone somewhere had been trained well enough to keep him safe. That was the true memorial to Ghost Unit 7. That was the promise kept. That was justice.